Ethan Caldwell was not the kind of man who stayed awake past midnight without a reason, but that night's sleep refused to come. His penthouse towered high above the glittering skyline of Manhattan, yet the city below offered no comfort. Sitting alone in the leather chair of his study, a half-empty glass of bourbon resting on the desk, he felt the heavy silence of the home pressing in on him. Out of habit, more than curiosity, he reached for the small remote beside him and switched on the security monitors. Most nights, the screens showed nothing but stillness, empty hallways, locked gates, dark rooms, but tonight, one image made his breath still. The pool on the lower terrace shimmered faintly under the pale glow of the underwater lights, and in the center of the water was a figure, at first just a shadow blurred by ripples, but as the camera adjusted, he recognized Clare Bennett, his live-in maid. She wasn't cleaning or working. She was curled in the water, completely bare, her back to the camera, her shoulders trembling as her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her long wet hair clinging to her pale skin. She looked small, fragile, and heartbreakingly alone. Ethan should have looked away. It would have been the proper thing to do, but something in the sight rooted him in place. It wasn't her body that held him there. It was the grief, raw and unguarded, wrapped around her like the water itself. He had seen grief before in hospital rooms, in his late wife's eyes, in the mirror, night after night, for years, and the memory struck him with painful clarity. Abruptly, he switched off the monitor, his hand trembling slightly as he set down the remote. Leaning back in his chair, he closed his eyes, but the image burned behind them like a ghost he couldn't banish, and every time he tried to sleep, he saw her again, floating, still. Fragile. Clare had been working in his home for nearly a year, rarely speaking unless addressed, always polite and reserved, performing her duties with precision and leaving no trace of herself behind, until now she had been a shadow in his carefully controlled world. But after that night on the screen, she became all he could think about. The next morning he lingered in the kitchen longer than usual, his gaze drifting toward the hallway. And when she finally entered wearing her modest gray uniform with her hair neatly tied and her eyes lowered, a strange pressure built in his chest. She greeted him softly and moved toward the sink, and though he didn't speak, something inside him shifted. Something had broken in that girl, and for the first time in years, Ethan realized he wanted to do something for someone else, not for business, not for appearances, but because he couldn't stand the thought of her disappearing into the silence. Ethan Caldwell had built his empire on logic, precision, and ruthless focus. At only 39, he was already one of the wealthiest men in New York, a name murmured in boardrooms and splashed across financial headlines. His company had revolutionized predictive analytics, turning complex algorithms into billions. Yet with every quarterly success, his distance from the world seemed to widen. Since the death of his wife, Emily, 3 years earlier, his life had become a carefully managed silence. The sprawling penthouse overlooking Central Park had turned into a monument of order and control, immaculate but lifeless. There were no photographs on the walls, no warmth in the hallways, just curated art. That meant nothing to him, and rooms so pristine they felt untouched by human life. The staff he employed, housekeepers, chefs, rotating assistants, were efficient and invisible, people who maintained the illusion of perfection without ever disturbing it. Clare Bennett was one of them. She had come recommended by an exclusive agency, someone quiet, discreet, and willing to work long hours for generous pay. She lived in a small suite tucked into a corner of the property, rarely leaving and never requesting time off. In nearly 12 months of employment, Ethan could count the number of times she had spoken more than a few words to him. She moved through the space like a shadow, efficient, wordless, as if her presence was designed never to be noticed. Until that night at the pool. Now he found himself noticing everything, the slight redness around her eyes in the mornings, the way she froze if he entered a room unexpectedly, the quiet hum of a tune under her breath as she worked when she thought no one could hear. Her grief was different from his own. She wasn't simply sad, she was surviving by the smallest margin. That week, Ethan began adjusting his routine without realizing it. He lingered at home more, canceling meetings he didn't need, finding reasons to walk through the kitchen when she was there, asking simple questions about whether she liked the meals the chef prepared or if her room was comfortable enough. Her responses were always polite but guarded, her eyes lowered before she returned to her work. Yet something had shifted between them. Something unspoken but undeniable. He began to understand that Clare was not just a maid doing her duties, she was a woman carrying something heavy. Something that was slowly drowning her, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt an unfamiliar pull. Not toward power or control, but toward understanding. In the days that followed, Ethan began noticing things he had never paid attention to before. Clare's presence, once so easy to overlook, now felt like a quiet current running beneath the rhythm of his home. He saw how her eyes, though calm, always carried a hint of exhaustion. How her shoulders tensed whenever he entered a room unexpectedly. And how she worked with a precision that seemed less about discipline and more about keeping herself invisible. She moved quietly, gliding from task to task as if she had been trained to leave no trace of herself anywhere. But now that he had seen her in that pool, raw and unguarded, Ethan couldn't stop seeing her. It was no longer just a job being performed in front of him. It was a life he didn't understand, a story he didn't know, and a sadness that stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. Without meaning to, he began rearranging his own life around hers. If she was scheduled to clean the study in the late morning, he would set up work there, pretending to be busy, but always keeping an eye on her. If she was doing laundry in the evenings, he found reasons to pass by, not to check on her work, but simply to exist in the same space. He started to notice her patterns. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she would slip out to the terrace, standing still by the pool and gazing into the water as though searching for answers hidden in its surface. She never noticed him watching from the windows above, and he never interrupted her. It wasn't just curiosity that drew him to her. It was the unspoken understanding that she was living in a silence almost as deep as his own. For years, Ethan had been surrounded by people who wanted something, influence, opportunity, but Clare wanted nothing. She didn't seek his attention, didn't ask for favors, didn't even seem to want to be seen. And yet, now that he had truly seen her, he found it impossible to look away. One afternoon, Ethan returned from a meeting earlier than planned and found Clare alone in the kitchen, struggling with a glass jar. She didn't see him enter. Head was slightly bowed, her hands gripping the lid as though sheer determination could force it open. He noticed the slight tremor in her fingers, the whiteness of her knuckles. And without saying a word, he stepped forward, gently taking the jar from her hands. It opened easily in his grip, the lid twisting free with almost no effort. When their eyes met, she startled slightly, her voice soft and controlled as she murmured a quiet thank you before looking away. He wanted to ask her something, if she was all right, if she was eating, if she ever truly rested, but all that came out was a single question, one that had been lingering in the back of his mind. "Do you like working here?" She hesitated before answering, her tone quiet but steady. "Yes, it's peaceful, peaceful." The word stayed with him far longer than it should have, because this home had never been a place of comfort. It was silent, orderly, almost cold. If that was her definition of peace, then she must have come from somewhere even lonelier. A few nights later, passing by the living room, Ethan stopped abruptly when he saw Clare standing in front of the piano. Her fingers hovered just above the keys, motionless. He didn't know she played. He had never seen her touch the instrument when anyone was around. Remaining in the shadow of the hallway, he watched as her fingers finally pressed down, producing a melody so soft and haunting that it seemed to fill every corner of the room. It wasn't just music. It was sorrow woven into sound, each note carrying the weight of something unspoken. When she finished, she sat still for a moment, her eyes lowered. Ethan stepped forward then, his voice gentle. "That was beautiful." She jumped slightly, her cheeks flushing as she stammered, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean." "Don't apologize." He interrupted softly. "Please don't stop." Her expression shifted, almost uncertain, before she admitted, I haven't played in a long time. It didn't sound like it, he replied, and he meant it. Her playing wasn't just skill. It was feeling, the kind he hadn't heard in years. When he asked her about the song, she told him it was a lullaby her mother used to hum. A tune passed down in her family without a name. That night, for the first time, they spoke as more than employer and employee. She told him fragments of her past, where she was from, the dreams she once had, the life she'd left behind. He listened, really listened, and though her words carried sadness, there was a quiet strength in them. The next morning, without a word, Ethan left a package outside her door, a collection of new piano sheet music, and a short note that simply read, "The house needs this. Play more." Signed only with his initial. It was never mentioned aloud. But that evening, the piano sang again, slowly and carefully, as though her heart was testing the air. It was late one evening when the shift came. Ethan returned from a business dinner earlier than expected, the city lights still glittering outside the windows as he stepped into the penthouse. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of music coming from the piano room. Clare was there, her fingers resting lightly on the keys, but she wasn't playing. She was staring down at them, her posture tense, her expression distant. He approached quietly, his voice soft. "Do you want to play something?" Her hands fell to her lap as she turned to face him. "I was thinking about something I haven't told you," she said, her voice low, uncertain. "You don't have to," Ethan replied gently, but she shook her head. "I do, because you've been kind to me, and I can't accept that kindness without telling you who I really am." Ethan sat down across from her, giving her his full attention. She inhaled deeply, her eyes clouded with more than sadness, there was fear there too. "I had a daughter," she began. "Her name was Lily. She was 3 years old." Her voice caught on the words, but she pushed forward. "She was everything to me. My joy, my light. When I came to New York, I brought her with me. It wasn't easy. I had to leave her father behind. He wasn't safe. I had to get her away from him. We crossed state lines, and I promised her life would be better here." Her gaze dropped to the floor. "Last year she got sick. At first, I thought it was just a cold, but it got worse. I didn't have health insurance. I didn't have the right papers. I was afraid to take her to a hospital, afraid they would take her away from me, so I waited too long. By the time I finally rushed her to the emergency room, it was too late." Ethan felt the air tighten around him as her words sank in. "She died that night, in my arms. One moment she was warm, and the next she wasn't." Claire's voice broke, but she didn't cry. Her silence was heavier than tears. "After that, I stopped being a mother. I stopped being anything. I came here because I needed somewhere to disappear. A job where no one would ask questions. I needed quiet. I needed silence. And then? You saw me." She looked at him now, her eyes glassy but steady. "I didn't mean for that night at the pool to happen. I wasn't trying to do anything. I wanted to feel the water, to float, to be close to something that didn't hurt. I didn't know the cameras were still on." Ethan didn't speak right away. His voice was low when he finally said, "I'm sorry. Not for not seeing sooner." Her lips trembled faintly before she whispered, "Thank you for not looking at me like I'm broken." "You're not broken," he said firmly. "You've survived what most people couldn't." She rose to her feet, trying to pull herself back into composure. "I should get back to work." As she turned to leave, Ethan said her name softly. She looked back. "You're not invisible here. Not anymore." She left the room quietly, but her presence lingered, and so did the ache she carried. That night, Ethan lay awake, his mind full not of numbers, not of business, but of her story, and the little girl she had loved and lost. The next morning, Ethan woke earlier than usual. He didn't go to the office, didn't answer the calls, piling onto his phone, and for the first time in years he stepped into his own kitchen with a purpose that wasn't about business. The cooking wasn't perfect, the eggs were overdone, the toast a little dry, but there were 2 plates on the counter when Claire walked in. She stopped in the doorway, surprise flickering across her face. "I thought maybe," he said carefully. "You'd join me, just for breakfast." Her eyes moved from him to the plate, hesitating as though unsure if it was really an invitation. Slowly, she nodded. Okay, it wasn't much, just a quiet meal, a few words, the sound of cutlery tapping against plates, but something shifted. The silence between them didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt comfortable. Breakfast became a quiet routine, something neither of them spoke about, but both came to expect. Ethan was always in the kitchen first, awkwardly working at the stove, but improving each time. Claire entered shyly, her steps hesitant at first. But over the days, the distance between them seemed to shorten. They didn't talk about deep things in those mornings. It was small details, the weather, a song she'd been playing on the piano, his oddly specific dislike of oranges, her preference for Earl Grey tea. They were ordinary conversations, but in a home that had forgotten how to feel alive, they were enough to bring a sense of warmth back into the air. The house began to feel different. The stillness was no longer suffocating, it was calm. The spaces that once felt like a museum now felt quietly lived in. Claire's presence was no longer just background noise, it was becoming a part of his life, steady and unspoken, but essential, and though neither of them admitted it aloud, they both knew something was changing. Over the weeks, their quiet breakfasts became part of a rhythm neither of them dared to name. It was as if the house itself had started to breathe again, and slowly, Ethan found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. Looking forward to coming home. Their moments together grew without effort. Sometimes he would pass the library and find a book she had left on the table, a novel with passages marked. Out of curiosity, he read one, finishing it in 2 nights. And when he mentioned it to her the next morning, her eyes lit just faintly. They began discussing the stories in the quiet corners of the house, sometimes seated under the tree in the garden. As though the outside world didn't exist, the piano became another bridge between them. One evening, Ethan stepped into the music room and found Claire playing softly. When she noticed him, she didn't stop. Instead, she looked at him with a hint of challenge and asked if he had ever played. His answer was a short laugh, but she moved over on the bench and placed her fingers over his, guiding them to the right keys. Her touch was light, almost hesitant, but it lingered. Ethan watched her as she taught him a simple melody, noticing the way she relaxed when she was focused on the music, the way her voice softened when she explained each note. Their closeness grew without either of them forcing it. Conversations stretched longer, silences felt safer, and the distance that had once defined their relationship quietly dissolved. One night, rain tapped against the windows while they sat on the floor of the music room, surrounded by scattered books and half-finished sheets of music. The air between them was heavy but not tense, it was filled with something unspoken. Ethan looked at her, really looked, and said quietly, "You make this house feel like a home again." Claire's breath caught, her eyes shifting as if she wasn't sure she wanted to believe it. He reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek, his hand lingering near her face. For a moment neither moved, and then, slowly, he leaned. In their lips, met nod with urgency, but with hesitation, as if both were asking a question they already knew the answer to. When they pulled apart, she whispered, "I didn't think I could feel this again." "Neither did I," he murmured, his forehead resting lightly against hers. In the days that followed, the air between them felt different, softer, warmer, still fragile, like something precious neither of them wanted to break. The change came quietly, without warning. One afternoon, while dusting the upstairs hallway, Claire noticed a door slightly ajar. She had walked past it countless times, always closed, always avoided. This time, something drew her closer. Pushing it open gently, she stepped inside. It was a studio, untouched, frozen in time. Canvases leaned against the walls, sketches rested, half-finished on an easel, jars of paint sat dried and cracked. The air carried the faint scent of turpentine and memory. Photos were scattered across a table, pictures of Emily, Ethan's late wife, smiling in moments of a life that had ended too soon. Claire's eyes fell on one canvas in particular. It was unfinished, but the image stopped her breath. It was a portrait of a woman with dark hair and sad eyes that looked far too much like her own. Her chest tightened as if the room itself was closing in. Slowly, she stepped back, leaving everything untouched, but the weight of what she had seen followed her. That evening, she was quiet at dinner. She didn't sit at the piano. Her usual, calm presence was replaced by a distance Ethan couldn't name. When he asked if something was wrong, she only said she was tired. The next morning, she was gone. Her room was clean, her belongings packed, not a note left behind. Panic rose in Ethan like a wave crashing against him. He called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Checking the security footage, he saw her leaving through the front gate before sunrise. The house felt hollow again. Days passed, then a week. He worked, he attended meetings, he went through the motions of life, but every room echoed with her absence. The piano stayed silent, the garden felt empty. Even the air seemed heavier. Eventually he couldn't ignore it. He called in favors, hired investigators, determined to find her. It took time, but at last there was news. She had been seen in a small town near the state border, working at a shelter for mothers and children. Ethan didn't tell anyone where he was going. He simply got in his car and drove. The shelter was a small, humble building with peeling white paint and children playing in the dusty yard. Inside, the air smelled faintly of soap and warm soup. Ethan stepped through the doorway, scanning the hall until a volunteer pointed him toward the back room. He found Clare there, sitting on the floor with a circle of children, reading softly. From a worn picture book, her voice was calm, but there was a gentleness in her expression he hadn't seen in weeks. When she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, her lips parted slightly, but no words came. "You left," he said. Quietly, she set the book aside, her hands resting in her lap. "I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That I was just a replacement," she admitted, her voice trembling. "That I was filling a space in your heart that never really belonged to me." Ethan stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "You're not a shadow, Clare. You're not second to anyone. You are you. And I love you." Her breath caught, and her eyes closed for a moment, as though the words were too much to hold. "I wasn't ready," she whispered. "I know," he replied softly. "But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She hesitated for a long moment before stepping toward him. Her hand slipped into his, tentative but real, and he held it tightly, as though grounding her to the moment. "I don't want a home without you in it," he said. Something in her expression softened though. She didn't answer right away. Finally, she whispered, "I want to believe you." He brought her hand to his lips. "Then, let me prove it." A week later, Clare returned to the penthouse with him. There were no grand announcements, no explanations to the staff. She unpacked her things slowly, taking her time placing them in the same room she had once lived in quietly. But this time, she wasn't hiding. She was choosing to be there. Ethan didn't push. He gave her space, waiting for her to come to him when she was ready. Slowly, the house began to feel alive again, the piano playing softly in the evenings, her voice occasionally drifting through the rooms as she hummed while she worked. It wasn't instant, but they were rebuilding something. Together, it was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when the quiet they had rebuilt was disrupted. Clare had gone into the city to run errands, and Ethan was in his study reviewing documents when his lawyer called. "There's something you should see," the lawyer said. "An envelope arrived this morning. It's from someone connected to Clare's past." Ethan's stomach tightened as he listened. The letter was short, but every word was laced with menace. It was from Lily's biological father, the man Clare had fled from. He claimed he knew where she was, hinted at exposing her situation, and demanded money to stay silent. Ethan's instinct was immediate and fierce. He would do whatever it took to protect her. He didn't tell her about the letter that day. Instead, he quietly called security, arranged for surveillance, and hired someone to track the man's movements. When Clare returned home that evening, she was smiling faintly, holding a bouquet of fresh flowers for the entryway. Ethan forced himself to match her calm, hiding the weight of the secret pressing on him. But secrets have a way of surfacing. A week later, while tidying his study, Claire noticed a stack of papers on his desk and the corner of the envelope peeking out. She picked it up, without thinking, and froze. Her eyes scanned just enough to understand before she set it down again, her hands trembling. When Ethan walked in, she was standing there, pale and silent. "You didn't tell me," she said, her voice low. "I was going to," he replied quickly, stepping toward her. "I just wanted to handle it first." Her eyes narrowed, hurt flickering across her expression. "You lied. I protected you," he said, his voice firm but quiet. "You don't get to decide how I face my past," she said sharply. "That's not love, Ethan. That's control." Her words struck harder than he expected. She shook her head, stepping back. "I thought we were building something real, but maybe we're just pretending." She left the room without another word. This time she didn't pack her things. She didn't leave the penthouse, but the space between them grew cold. She kept her distance, retreating into her quiet again. Ethan didn't chase her. He waited, knowing trust couldn't be repaired with quick promises. Days passed. The house felt heavier again, but this time she was still there, just out of reach. Several quiet days passed before anything changed. Then one morning, Ethan woke to the faint sound of movement in the kitchen. It wasn't the chef, it was Clare. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air, mixed with the subtle warmth of eggs and toasted bread. He stepped into the kitchen to find her standing at the counter, focused on preparing breakfast. When she looked at him, her eyes were calmer than they had been in days, though still unreadable. "I was wrong too," she said softly. "I've been running from the truth, just as much as you tried to shield me from it." Ethan moved closer, careful with his words. "I thought if I could control the situation, I could protect you. But I see now, that wasn't my decision to make." Her gaze softened, just slightly. "I know why you did it, and I know you meant well, but we promised each other no more hiding, not from each other." They stood in silence for a moment, neither needing to fill it with explanations. She handed him a plate, the smallest of gestures, but one that felt like a step back toward each other. That evening, they sat by the pool. The water shimmered under the fading light of the sunset, the same place she had once cried alone. Now it reflected warmth, not sorrow. Voice was quiet when she spoke. "There's something else I haven't told you," she admitted. "I've been seeing someone, a grief counselor, once a week." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then smiled gently. "I'm proud of you. I want to be whole again," she said, her eyes steady on the water. "Not for you, for me. You already are," he whispered. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time, she let herself believe it. That night, she asked him to sleep beside her, not out of fear or loneliness, but because she wanted him there. And he did no promises. No conditions, just the people choosing each other in the quiet after everything they'd survived. The wedding was quiet, just the way they wanted it. No photographers, no headlines, no grand displays, only a small circle of people who mattered. Ethan stood beneath the blooming magnolia tree in the garden, waiting in the soft afternoon light. His heart didn't beat with nerves. It beat with something steadier, something deeper. Peace. Clare appeared at the edge of the garden, barefoot in the grass, her simple ivory dress flowing gently in the breeze, her hair loose around her shoulders with a single white flower tucked behind her ear. Her eyes never left his as she walked toward him. And in that moment she looked radiant, not because of the dress or the setting, but because she had returned to herself, whole and alive. They exchanged vows and voices just above a whisper, words meant only for each other. "I loved you before I knew your story," Ethan said softly, "and I love you even more because of it." Claire's voice trembled with emotion. "You saw me when I had nothing left. You gave me space to remember who I was, and you stayed." After the ceremony, they sat by the pool, the place where everything had quietly begun. The water was calm now, no longer a mirror for grief, but a reflection of change. Clare leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice barely above the sound of the breeze. "Do you think Lily would be proud of me?" Ethan took her hand gently. "I know she would." You didn't just survive, you became someone she would want to grow into. Months passed, and the house remained the same in structure, but everything inside it was different. Laughter returned to the rooms. Music drifted from the piano in the evenings. Meals were shared. Not in silence, but with stories, smiles, and glances that spoke volumes. Claire began teaching piano to children from the shelter, her joy for music finding new life. Ethan established a foundation in Lily's name, dedicated to helping families access the care they needed without fear. The man who once buried himself in spreadsheets now sat in circles of children, reading stories and listening to laughter that made the house feel alive again. One afternoon, Claire stepped outside to find Ethan in the garden, building a swing beneath the magnolia tree. She smiled faintly. "Who's it for?" "For us," he said, with a small grin. "For now, for later, for whatever comes next." She kissed him there in the sunlight, with the scent of summer in the air. Because it wasn't about filling a void anymore. It wasn't about saving each other. It was about choosing to stay, every single day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Love hadn't erased the past, it had honored it, and in doing so, it gave them something stronger than a new beginning. It gave them a future. Sometimes, the person who saves you doesn't arrive with answers, but with presence, patience, and the willingness to stay beside your pain until you're ready to stand. Ethan had lost everything once. Claire had nearly disappeared beneath her grief, but they had found each other not perfectly, not quickly, but completely. And in that imperfect journey, they built a life worth coming home to every single day. Because real love isn't loud, it's steady. It's the quiet voice that says, "I'm here, and I'm not leaving. Not this time."